The first letter had been written in a fit of rebellion, the ink blotted with Josie Whitmore's restless energy. 29 years old and suffocating under the weight of Missouri's expectations, she'd sat at her aunt's mahogany writing desk, back straight, lips pursed, and penned words no proper lady would dare send a stranger. If you're expecting delicate sentiments and blushing confessions, you've written to the wrong woman. I read Homer for pleasure, argue politics at dinner parties, and have been told my wit is unseemly by every marriageable gentleman in St. Louis. Should this dissuade you, I'll consider it a favor. She'd sealed it with a flourish, never imagining the response that would come 3 weeks later. A single page of plain stationery, the handwriting bold and uneven, as if written by a hand more accustomed to reins than pens. Miss Whitmore, your honesty is a thunderclap in a drought. I've no use for simpering. The Montana Territory demands grit, and I'd rather share my fire with a woman who thinks than one who merely decorates. If you've the courage to continue this exchange, you'll find me a willing correspondent. Daniel O'Connell, Gallatin Valley Stock and Grain. The letters that followed became her secret lifeline. Through the sweltering Missouri summer, Josie would steal moments to write, perched on the porch swing with her skirts hitched up, or late at night when the house creaked with judgmental silence. Daniel's words painted a world she could taste, the bite of mountain air, the endless sweep of grasslands, the satisfying ache of a day's honest labor. She confessed her fears, too, of fading into spinsterhood, of never being truly seen. His reply had been swift. Invisibility is a cage of others' making. Out here, a woman's worth is measured by her metal, not her matrimonial prospects. When his invitation arrived, come see if the man matches the letters, Josie hadn't hesitated. She packed her books, her mother's pearl brooch, and every cherished page of their correspondence, the paper soft at the creases from constant rereading. The train west was a rattling beast of iron and steam, the landscape outside shifting from lush farmland to endless golden prairie. Josie pressed her forehead to the glass, watching as towns grew scarcer and the sky expanded. She'd worn her best traveling suit, forest green to match the eyes Daniel had once written about admiring in a daguerreotype she'd finally sent, and pinned her hair just so, though the humidity had long since loosened her careful curls. Her fingers traced the latest letter in her lap, its edges frayed from anxious handling. You'll know me by the black Stetson and the fact I'll be the fool grinning like it's Christmas morning. The words had warmed her through the long journey. But when the train hissed to a stop in Gallatin Valley, the man waiting on the platform wore no grin. He was younger than she had imagined, early 20s at most, with sun-bleached hair escaping from under a battered hat. The sign in his hands read, Josie Whitmore, in clumsy block letters. Miss Whitmore? He stepped forward, his voice deeper than expected. I'm Emmett, Daniel's brother. The world tilted. Josie's gloved hand flew to the letters in her reticule, their weight suddenly foreign. Is Daniel unwell? Emmett's gaze dropped to his boots. There's been a misunderstanding. Behind him, a tumbleweed skittered across the tracks, mocking in its freedom. The truth settled like Montana dust, slow, inescapable. She'd crossed 1,000 miles to meet a man who hadn't written a single word.
The Montana wind whipped Josie's skirts as she stood frozen on the train platform, her gloved fingers crushing the latest letter in her reticule. The man before her, broad-shouldered and sun-browned, with a cocky grin that didn't match the careful prose she'd fallen for, hefted her trunk like it weighed nothing. "You're not Daniel," she said, the words barely audible over the screech of releasing steam. Emmett O'Connell tipped his hat, his eyes dancing with amusement. "No, ma'am, but I am the better-looking O'Connell brother, so I'd call this a happy accident." He reached for her carpet bag. "Daniel's knee-deep in calving season. Sent me to fetch you proper." Fetch you? As if she were misplaced livestock. Josie's stays dug into her ribs as she inhaled sharply. After 8 months of correspondence, after Daniel had written, "Your words are the lantern that guides me through these long nights," he couldn't spare an afternoon to meet her train? The wagon rod to the ranch stretched like taffy in July heat. Montana's grandeur should have stolen her breath. The endless golden prairies, the snow-capped absarcas clawing at the sky, but Josie saw none of it. Her attention snagged on Emmett's rough hands handling the reins, so different from the elegant script she'd memorized. "You're awful quiet for a woman who wrote 37 pages about the suffragette movement," Emmett remarked as they hit a bump. Josie's head snapped up. "You've read my letters?" "Had to." He flicked the reins. "Daniel makes us listen at supper like we're at some damn literary society." Ice flooded her veins. Those letters contained her deepest fears, the way she'd hidden in the linen closet when her aunt brought suitors to call, her secret relief when the last one called her too clever by half. Daniel had shared them like parlor entertainment. The ranch house emerged from a copse of aspens just as the sun gilded the western peaks. A lanky figure detached from the barn shadows, moving with the careful precision she'd imagined when reading Daniel's descriptions of breaking wild mustangs. But when he stepped into the lantern light, the man before her bore no resemblance to the voice from the letters. His handshake was perfunctory, his greeting stiff. "Miss Whitmore, the guest room is prepared." Not, "You're even more captivating than I dreamed." Not, "I've played this moment in my mind 1,000 times." Just, "The guest room is prepared." Behind them, Emmett snorted. "Hell, Daniel, she didn't come all this way to inspect the linens." Daniel's jaw twitched. Something unspoken crackled between the brothers, a current of tension that raised the fine hairs on Josie's neck. That night, Josie knelt by the guest room window, Daniel's last letter trembling in her hands. "When you step on that platform, I'll be the man who forgets his own name." Outside, the brothers argued by the corral, their shadows monstrous in the flickering lantern light. Emmett threw his head back in laughter at some unheard remark, the same laughter that had punctuated their wagon ride whenever she'd said something sharp. The letters had wit. The letters had passion. This stiff-shouldered stranger by the corral had neither. Josie pressed a hand to her mouth as the truth detonated like gunpowder in her veins. She'd traveled halfway across the continent for the wrong brother.
The wind moaned through the cabin's eaves like a restless spirit, stirring the lace curtains of Josie's borrowed room. She sat stiffly on the narrow bed, the lamplight guttering as she spread the letters across the quilt, each crease and ink smudge a testament to how often she'd traced these words with reverent fingers. Something was wrong. The Daniel she'd met at sunset, all stiff shoulders and averted eyes, bore no resemblance to the man who'd written, "Your mind dazzles me like prairie lightning." That Daniel had quoted Keats while describing calving season. This one had mumbled about the weather and excused himself before dessert. She unfolded the first letter, its paper soft as old petals. "Dear Miss Whitmore, if cleverness were a crime, you'd hang at dawn, and I'd volunteer as an executioner just to hear your final quip." Her thumb lingered over the looping signature. That playful voice had kept her company through endless Missouri evenings, had made her laugh out loud in her aunt's stifling parlor. But the real Daniel, he'd barely managed 3 sentences at supper. A burst of laughter echoed from below. Emmett's rich baritone cangled with a ranch hand's guffaw. Josie crept to the door, pressing her ear against the rough wood. "So then I told him, 'That ain't a bull, it's your wife in trousers.'" Emmett's voice carried up the stairs, followed by the clink of whiskey glasses. Her chest tightened. That easy humor, that razor wit, it was all there in the letters, but Daniel had just stared at his plate through supper, pushing peas with his fork. At dawn, she found Emmett in the barn, currying a Palomino mare, his shirt sleeves rolled to reveal forearms corded with muscle. Sunlight streamed through the hayloft, gilding the dust motes swirling around them. "You're up with the chickens," he remarked without turning. The horse nickered as Josie stepped closer. "I needed air." She trailed fingers along the stall door. "Emmett, who really wrote the letters?" The brush stilled.
For 3 heartbeats, the only sound was the mare's contented chewing. He turned slowly, wiping his hands on his trousers. "What makes you ask?" She lifted her chin. The man who wrote, "Freedom isn't a place, but a state of mind," didn't spend supper discussing rainfall patterns. Emmett exhaled sharply through his nose. The Palomino nudged his shoulder, but his gaze never left Josie's. "Daniel can sign his name well enough, but poetry, philosophy?" He shook his head. "First time he asked for help, I figured it was a lark. Then you wrote back, and I kept writing." The confession hung between them, thick as barn dust. Josie's nails bit into her palms. "Those were my secrets, my heart. And mine." Emmett stepped closer, the hay crunching under his boots. "Every word about wide-open skies, that was me watching sunrise after branding season. The Whitman quotes from my ma's old book." His calloused hand hovered near hers on the stall door. "The part about your laugh being like church bells, that was all me." The sunset painted the pasture in molten gold as Josie stood alone by the fence. Behind her, the ranch house glowed with lamplight, Emmett reading his newspaper in stolid silence. Ahead, the bunkhouse rang with laughter, Emmett holding court as always. She pressed the final letter to her chest, the paper whispering against her bodice. "When you come to Montana, bring your sharp tongue and sharper mind. I'll supply the wide horizons and the courage to meet them." Tears blurred the signature, not Daniel's cramped script, but Emmett's bold hand, the truth hiding in plain ink. What shattered worst, the deception or the terrifying joy flooding her veins at the thought that the soul she'd fallen for did exist, just not in the man she'd promised to marry?
Dawn bled across the valley in streaks of rose and amber, the light catching on the dew-kissed grass as Josie marched toward the corral. The morning air carried the scent of leather and hay, of horses steering in their stalls, ordinary sounds that now felt charged with meaning. Daniel stood at the fence, his broad back to her as he tested a post. He didn't turn until her shadow crossed his boots. "Josie," his voice was rough with surprise. "You're up early." She didn't soften the blow. "The man who wrote those letters doesn't exist, does he?" Daniel's hand stilled on the fence rail. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant call of a meadowlark. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the mountains, he turned to face her. "I asked Emmett to help with the first one," he admitted, his gaze steady but weary. "Didn't expect him to take over. But when your replies came..." He shrugged, the gesture painfully awkward. "He liked writing them. I liked reading yours. Seemed fair." Fair. The word landed like a spur to the ribs. Josie clutched her shawl tighter, the fabric rough under her trembling fingers. "Those letters were my heart, Daniel. You let me fall for a ghost." The rising sun caught the silver strands at his temples as he frowned. "I'm real. This ranch is real. I can give you stability." "What about laughter?" she interrupted, her voice cracking. "What about staying up too late arguing about books? What about knowing each other?" Daniel's jaw worked silently. In the distance, a horse whinnied, the sound lonely in the vast expanse of land. "That ain't me," he said at last. "But I'd treat you right. That's not nothing." It wasn't. But as Josie studied his face, the honest lines, the quiet dignity, she realized with a pang that he was offering a partnership, not a love story. And after months of baring her soul to a kindred spirit, she couldn't unlearn the difference. Without another word, she turned away, her boots kicking up little puffs of dust that hung in the air like unanswered questions. She found Emmett behind the barn, splitting logs with violent precision. Each swing of the axe sent wood chips flying, the rhythm faltering only when he noticed her approach. "You told him?" It wasn't a question. Josie stopped just outside the arc of his axe. "I had to."
He wiped his brow with his sleeve, his breathing uneven. And now? Now I need to understand why. She stepped closer, the morning light revealing the flecks of gold in his green eyes, eyes she had imagined a dozen times while reading his words. You wrote about honesty like it was sacred, but this was a lie from the start. Emmett drove the axe into the stump with a thud. The first time I read your letter, the one about hiding in the linen closet, I felt like you'd cracked open my chest. His voice dropped to a raw whisper. Nobody gets that. Not Daniel, not anyone in this damn territory. But you knew. A gust of wind sent the aspen leaves trembling above them, dappling his face in shifting light and shadow. I kept writing because I was selfish, because for the first time in my life, someone saw me in the words, not just the reckless little brother. He reached for her hand, then stopped himself. But you deserve more than stolen letters and a man with nothing to his name but a sharp tongue. She studied him. The ink-stained fingers, the sun-bleached hair, the familiar wit hiding behind the guilt. This was the man who'd made her feel understood across 1,000 miles. The man who'd memorized her favorite Whitman verses. The man who'd lied to her face for months. Her heart ached with the terrible, beautiful truth. Some loves were complicated. Some truths took time. "Show me," she said suddenly. "What?" "Show me the Montana from your letters, the real one." She folded her arms, her chin lifting in challenge. "And I'll decide if the man matches the words." For the first time since she'd arrived, Emmett's smile reached his eyes, bright and unguarded, and exactly like the voice in those letters. "That's a dangerous offer, Josephine Whitmore." The wind carried the scent of sage and possibility as they stood there, on the edge of something neither could name. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle blew. But for once, Josie didn't feel the urge to run toward it.
The Montana summer stretched golden and endless, each day melting into the next like honey in sun-warmed tea. Josie stayed, not because she'd made a decision, but because she needed to breathe the same air as the truth for once. She watched Emmett, not the way she'd watched men in Missouri parlors, waiting for flaws to reveal themselves, but with the quiet attention of someone learning a new language. She noted how he gentled skittish colts with murmured words, how his calloused hands cradled injured chicks like they were made of glass, how he left wildflowers on her windowsill at dawn, purple lupin, yellow balsam root, their stems still damp with dew. No declarations, no grand gestures, just small, stubborn acts of devotion that felt more honest than any love letter. One evening, as fireflies blinked in the pasture, Josie found Emmett repairing a bridle on the porch. The fading light caught the silver scars on his knuckles, the sun-bleached strands in his hair. "Why did you stay?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. "On this ranch, in your brother's shadow." Emmett's needle stilled. For a moment, the only sound was the creak of the porch swing between them. "Used to dream of San Francisco," he admitted, threading the needle through worn leather. "Wanted to see the ocean. Then your first letter came." His eyes lifted, holding hers. "Turns out the whole world can fit on a page." The admission hung between them, fragile as the spiderweb glinting in the lantern light. Josie's chest ached with the rightness of it, this man who'd spun words into lifelines, who understood that adventure wasn't always about distance. She reached for his hand, tracing the ink stain on his index finger, the permanent mark of a man who lived by the pen. "Show me." Emmett's brow furrowed. "Your Montana, not the one from the letters, the real one." He took her to the high meadow at midnight. No lanterns, no path, just the Milky Way strewn across the sky like diamond dust, so bright that it cast their shadows on the grass. Emmett spread his coat on the ground, the wool still warm from his body. "This is where I wrote the Whitman letter," he confessed, lying back to gaze at the stars. Sat right here with your words in my pocket and the whole universe laughing at me for falling in love with a woman I'd never met. Josie's breath caught. She'd memorized that particular letter, the one about the indescribable glory of Montana nights. Now she understood why the prose had felt so alive. It had been written here, with earth under her nails and heaven in her eyes. She lay beside him, their shoulders brushing. "Say it again, what you wrote that night." Emmett turned his head, his nose nearly touching hers. "That the stars here don't just shine, they sing." His voice dropped to a whisper. "That I wished you could hear them." A meteor streaked across the sky, its tail burning blue-white. Josie's fingers found his in the grass, threading together like they'd been made to fit. "I hear them," she murmured. And just like that, the last pretense between them crumbled. At dawn, they stood at the train station, not for goodbye, but to send a telegram to Missouri. Josie watched as Emmett tapped out the message with sure fingers. "Stop, Aunt Lydia, stop. Not coming home. Stop." The station master arched a brow. "That all?" Emmett grinned, sliding his arm around Josie's waist. "Add, found better skies." As they walked back to the ranch, Josie realized she'd been wrong all along. She hadn't fallen for the words on the page. She'd fallen for the man who wrote them, for the way his laughter rumbled through her bones, for the quiet poetry in his everyday acts, for the fearless way he loved her, scars and sharp edges and all. The letters had been the map. This, his hand in hers, the sunrise painting the mountains pink, the future stretching before them like an unwritten page. This was the destination.
If you enjoyed listening to this story, do well to subscribe and drop your thoughts in the comment section. See you on our next video. Toodles!